Good evening. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where SpaceX is counting down to liftoff of a Falcon 9 rocket this evening at 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 4:50 a.m. UTC for those of you in other time zones. This mission will be deploying 40 internet satellites for OneWeb. And we hope to bring you a double header of launches tonight across the country at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. SpaceX is also counting down to liftoff of a different Falcon 9 rocket at 12:35 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 9:35 a.m. Pacific Time, or 5:35 a.m. UTC. That mission will be placing into orbit 51 Starlink internet satellites for SpaceX's own broadband network. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. I'll be bringing you live coverage throughout the next couple of hours as we await the liftoff of these two Falcon 9 rockets. The weather conditions here in Florida look quite favorable for launch this evening, a greater than 90% chance of acceptable weather conditions tonight on the Space Coast for liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket you're looking at live at Pad 40. However, it's a different story out in California, with high winds and heavy rainfall battering California's central coast at this hour. Some of those rainstorms appear to be pushing through the Vandenberg area with some clear skies behind them. So it's just going to be a question of timing, whether the skies clear in time and sufficiently to allow the Falcon 9 out at Vandenberg Space Force Base to get off the ground at 12:35 a.m. Eastern Time, 9:35 p.m. Pacific. So we're now 42 minutes away from the scheduled launch time here in Florida of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on the OneWeb 16 mission. This is the 16th launch overall for OneWeb's internet network, which is an indirect competitor to SpaceX's Starlink network. The Starlink network primarily focuses on providing consumer-grade broadband to individual customers around the world, whereas OneWeb focuses on enterprise-level services to companies, communities, schools, hospitals, and entire island nations, for example, cruise ships also in areas where traditional fiber connectivity is unavailable. These 40 satellites will bring the total number of OneWeb satellites launched to date to 544. OneWeb says it needs 588 satellites for uninterrupted global internet coverage with their network, so this will get them to 544. They plan to launch a total of about 650 of their first generation satellites over the next few months. That includes a number of spares in orbit as well. OneWeb later this decade plans to start deploying a second generation constellation of satellites, which could number in the thousands. And SpaceX has actually just confirmed just a moment ago that the launch out in California that we talked about at the start of our broadcast this evening has been scrubbed for the night due to weather conditions at Vandenberg Space Force Base. The backup opportunity that SpaceX will be targeting is tomorrow, Tuesday, at 11:02 p.m. Eastern Time or 8:02 p.m. Pacific Time for this next mission with the Starlink internet satellites on board. 51 Starlink satellites on that rocket out in California. SpaceX hopes for better weather tomorrow night for the backup launch opportunity for that mission, which is known as Starlink 2-4. We're now 40 minutes away from launch with excellent weather here in Florida for the OneWeb 16 mission. The next major milestone in the countdown this evening at the Cape will be the pre-launch readiness poll from SpaceX's Launch Control Center. That will be done by the launch director, and it's an electronic poll, so you won't be hearing any of the go, no-go calls you may hear on other launch broadcasts this evening. The launch controllers register their readiness with a mouse click or a button push on the keyboard. No voice poll of go, no-go expected this evening. And at T-minus 35 minutes, assuming all stations are go for launch, SpaceX will start loading kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40.
Issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Tanks are venting for propellant load. And the launch auto has started.
The countdown has just passed the T-minus 35-minute mark at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and the launch auto sequence is now underway. So propellants are now flowing into the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40. 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene, known as Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1, and liquid oxygen will be pumped into the Falcon 9 rocket over the next half hour or so, culminating in the scheduled liftoff of this rocket at 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:50 a.m. UTC. If you're just joining our live stream this evening and you haven't done so yet, we ask you to please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger following for our live launch coverage. We want to bring this late night launch to as many people as possible. And to help us do that, to help us gain a larger audience, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us out a lot. Inside of 34 minutes now until the liftoff time. The launch time is set for precisely 11:50 and 17 seconds, 11:50:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 4:50:17 a.m. UTC. Now, T-minus 28 minutes, 45 seconds until launch tonight of 40 OneWeb internet satellites from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. These 40 satellites are nestled on top of the Falcon 9 rocket, 229 feet tall, 70 meters in height, out on pad 40. These 40 satellites will add to the 504 satellites OneWeb already has launched over the course of 15 previous missions dating back to 2019 when OneWeb launched their first 10 test satellites. Here's a look at the what the satellites look like inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket. This photo was actually taken back a few weeks ago and before a launch in December that also carried 40 OneWeb satellites into orbit. These satellites are all identical. So what you're seeing in this image from before the last launch for OneWeb is very representative of what the satellites look like on this mission. So there are 40 spacecraft on board. These satellites are built by a company called OneWeb, Airbus OneWeb Satellites. It's a joint venture of Airbus Defense and Space and OneWeb, the factory where these satellites are mass produced in assembly line fashion is just outside the gate of Kennedy Space Center in Merritt Island, Florida, just a few miles from the SpaceX launch facilities here in Florida. Each spacecraft weighs about 325 pounds or 147.5 kilograms, fully fueled in launch configuration. The propulsion for each satellite is provided by a plasma thruster fueled by xenon. These satellites will be deployed into an orbit about 373 miles or 600 kilometers above the Earth. And they will use that xenon fuel electric propulsion system to raise their orbits from their deployment altitude up to an operating altitude of 745 miles or 1,200 kilometers over the course of several months. That'll take several months for that orbit raising to be completed, and then the satellites will be entering the operational OneWeb constellation, which is already providing services across regions of the Earth, large swaths of the planet, like Alaska, Canada, Northern Europe, and parts of Antarctica. The satellites on this launch will help lower or bring the OneWeb service to lower latitudes. So places like the United States, the Middle East, Southern Europe, as well as parts of the Asia-Pacific region will see their service level improve with these 40 new satellites. Ultimately, with the addition of a few more dozen satellites after this launch, OneWeb will be in a position to fully cover the entire globe with their broadband network. And the broadband network on the OneWeb satellites is provided through Ku-band user beams that directly connect the satellites to user terminals. And then the satellites use Ka-band gateway links to link up with ground stations as they provide the broadband service around the world. SpaceX's countdown is now passing inside of 24 minutes, 23 minutes, 50 seconds remaining until liftoff time tonight. Launch remains set for 11:50 p.m. Eastern Time, or 4:50 a.m. UTC. Here's a look at the SpaceX countdown timeline. These are some of the major events leading up to the scheduled liftoff time tonight. We've already passed a few of these milestones. At T-minus 38 minutes, we heard the go for propellant loading from SpaceX Launch Control. That propellant loading began at T-minus 35 minutes, concurrent with the start of the auto sequencer. That's the ground computer that oversees the entire Falcon 9 countdown all the way down to T-minus 60 seconds, at which point the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown. Coming up in a couple of minutes' time, at about T-minus 20 minutes and 30 seconds or so, the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded with kerosene fuel. Correction, the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded with kerosene fuel at 20 minutes, 30 seconds. That'll be followed a few minutes later by the start of loading of liquid oxygen onto the second stage at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, the thermal conditioning or chill down of the 9 first stage Merlin 1D engines will begin. At T-minus 6 minutes, the first stage kerosene tank should be fully loaded. At T-minus 4.5 minutes, the strongback, that's the structure standing vertical next to the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40, will be lowered to an angle of about 1.5 degrees in preparation for ignition. At T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be terminated on both stages. At that point, SpaceX will have a fully fueled, fully loaded 1.2 million pound Falcon 9 rocket ready to go. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, the onboard computer will take command of the countdown. That's the handoff from the ground computer to the onboard flight computer of the Falcon 9. Also at that time, the pressurization of the propellant tanks will get underway out at pad 40. At T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch conductor and launch director will verify their go for launch this evening. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will command the engine start sequence that uses an igniter fluid known as TTAB, triethyl aluminum, triethyl borane, that gives off a distinctive green flash. It's basically an ignition fluid to light the 9 Merlin engines. That green flash is quickly overcome by the orange glow of the Merlin engines as those engines light up. And then if those engines check out, if everything looks good, at T-minus 0, the rocket will give the command for the hold down clamps at the base of the Falcon 9 to open, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb into space with these 40 OneWeb internet satellites targeting a 373-mile high polar orbit this evening. Coming up in the next few moments, we hope to hear confirmation that the second stage has been fully loaded with RP-1 kerosene. That'll be followed by the so-called big vent from the strongback vent of oxygen vapors as preps get underway to load liquid oxygen into the upper stage. And there is the big vent right on time. And we did just hear confirmation that the kerosene fueling of the second stage has been completed. So the first of 4 propellant tanks on board the Falcon 9 is now loaded. 20 minutes to go until liftoff tonight. T-minus 17 minutes, 35 seconds until liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on the OneWeb 16 mission. There are 40 satellites for OneWeb buttoned up for liftoff inside the nose cone of the Falcon 9 out at pad 40. These satellites will expand the reach of OneWeb's internet network, adding 40 more satellites to the 504 spacecraft OneWeb has already launched on 15 previous rocket missions. The next major milestone in the countdown tonight will be the start of liquid oxygen loading on the second stage in the next 30 seconds to 1 minute or so. And at that time, we expect to see this big vent from the strongback terminate in the next few moments as liquid oxygen flow begins into stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket. Again, if you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. A Falcon 9 rocket is now 16 minutes from liftoff. This will be SpaceX's second mission of the year. Will also be the 16th launch overall for OneWeb, and the second of those to be on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket following SpaceX's first flight for OneWeb back in December, on December the 8th. Previous OneWeb launches primarily took off on Russian Soyuz rockets. However, that launch contract was effectively terminated after Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022. Russia refused to launch additional OneWeb satellites without concessions from OneWeb after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those included a divestiture of the UK government's stake in OneWeb. That demand, of course, was refused, and Russia refused to launch additional OneWeb missions. In fact, they have commandeered 30-plus OneWeb satellites that were already at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan ready for a launch last March. Those satellites remain in Baikonur under the custody of the Russian Space Agency. And that left OneWeb looking for other rides for their remaining satellites, and they signed a contract within weeks with SpaceX, as well as a contract with the New Space India Limited for a number of launches on Falcon 9 rockets and on 2 Indian GSLV rockets to complete the deployment of the OneWeb constellation. You're now seeing the second of 4 SpaceX launches that OneWeb has under contract on the pad tonight at Cape Canaveral, 14 minutes from liftoff. Liquid oxygen loading now underway on stage 2. This mission will be targeting a polar orbit at an inclination of 87 degrees to the equator. And to reach that orbit, the Falcon 9 rocket needs to fly south from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled the track of the Falcon 9 rocket here. This red line here shows the approximate path that the Falcon 9 rocket will take after liftoff from pad 40. It'll initially fly southeast out over the Atlantic Ocean, then perform what's known as a dogleg maneuver by vectoring the thrust from its engines to make a right-hand turn to fly on a more southerly course, roughly parallel to the east coast of Florida, flying almost directly over just east of West Palm Beach, Florida, and then out over the Florida Straits, Cuba, and the Caribbean Sea to inject these 40 OneWeb satellites into a polar orbit. The Falcon 9 booster will return to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station for landing about 8 minutes after liftoff, targeting a touchdown at landing zone 1, just a few miles south of pad 40, the departure point for tonight's flight. Now inside 12 minutes until liftoff. If you want to support our coverage as we continue monitoring, tracking, and covering launches from here on Florida Space Coast, you can do that a few different ways. One of those is to join our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from if you're interested in becoming a member. And depending on which membership level you select, you can gain access to bonus video features from our launch coverage for members only. You can also contribute in the super chat here on YouTube. And this money will help us continue to maintain our standard of coverage that we've had for now 23 years, since 1999, when Spaceflight Now began covering launches here at Cape Canaveral. As you may imagine, the number of launches has rapidly increased in recent years. And in order to keep up, we need some support from our loyal readers and listeners. And any contribution you can provide through the super chat or by becoming a member by joining our YouTube channel would go a long way. So if you consider that for us, we'd really appreciate that. Also, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. If you do that, it'll help us gain a larger audience for our live coverage this evening, as we're now 10 minutes, 35 seconds from liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. I want to give a big thank you to Bob Stanley and to Josh King for their contributions in the super chat. We appreciate those contributions and that support. As I mentioned, this helps us maintain and expand our coverage, as we're now in a new paradigm here on the Space Coast of Florida. There are up to 87 launches currently scheduled this year from Florida Space Coast. There were 57 last year, and just a few years ago, there was only about a dozen or so launches. So in order to keep up, we really appreciate your support. It helps us continue our coverage, and it goes a long way. So thanks. Countdown here at Cape Canaveral now inside of 9 minutes until liftoff. Next major milestone in the countdown will come at T-minus 7 minutes. That'll be the engine chill down. SpaceX's countdown just passed T-minus 7 minutes. That marks the start of the engine chill down on the first stage booster. This involves flowing a small amount of super cold cryogenic liquid oxygen through the engine plumbing, through the engine compartment to thermally condition some of that hardware for the faster flow of densified cryogenic oxidizer when those engines actually ignite. This helps protect that hardware against the thermal shock of that propellant. The liquid oxygen is densified. It's chilled down close to liquid oxygen's freezing point, several hundred degrees below zero. Also, at this point in the countdown, SpaceX should be completing verifications of the autonomous flight termination system on the Falcon 9 rocket. That's the self-destruct system that would be automatically activated to destroy the rocket in the event of a major mishap or if the rocket flies off course after liftoff. Also, at this point in the countdown, in the next few moments, the first stage should be confirmed fully loaded with kerosene fuel. It's 5 minutes, 15 seconds and counting. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 rocket, as we talked about a moment ago, will head south from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. After about a minute, the rocket will be flying at supersonic speed. The first stage of the Falcon 9 will shut down its 9 engines 2 minutes, 18 seconds into the flight. A few moments later, that booster will actually separate from the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. And then a few moments later, the second stage will light its single Merlin engine to continue the push into orbit. Meanwhile, the first stage will relight 3 of its engines for a boost back burn. If you're in the Cape Canaveral area here in Florida, their skies are very clear this evening. You could get a great look at that boost back burn engine exhaust plume, dancing with the plume of the second stage engine at the edge of space for a few seconds as those two rocket burns are occurring simultaneously. The upper stage will continue on into orbit with the 40 OneWeb satellites, while the first stage booster comes back to Earth, targeting a landing at landing zone 1 about 7 minutes and 56 seconds after launch, nearly 8 minutes after liftoff, as when that first stage booster will come back to Earth accompanied by sonic booms that should be heard across the spaceport and across Florida's Space Coast. The second stage, meanwhile, will enter orbit. It'll relight its engine for a second burn about 55 minutes into the flight, and then just shy of 59 minutes after launch is when the deployment sequence of these 40 OneWeb satellites will begin. It'll take more than 30 minutes for all 40 satellites to deploy from the Falcon 9 rocket. Out at pad 40, the strongback is now retracting away from the Falcon 9 rocket. It's reclining to an angle of about 1.5 degrees in preparation for engine ignition. That's the structure just to the right of the vehicle. If you look closely, it has reclined about 1.5 degrees from the rocket. The first stage booster flying tonight, booster 1076, is going for its second flight to space. This rocket previously launched and landed on a Dragon cargo resupply mission that launched to the International Space Station back on November the 26th.
Stage 1, lock load complete.
From Kennedy Space Center. And the booster is going for its second flight today. This Dragon spacecraft that it launched back in November actually undocked from the space station earlier today and is heading for splashdown to complete its resupply flight to the space station. Splashdown off the coast of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico is scheduled for early Wednesday morning, just before dawn. So it's a busy week for SpaceX, with this launch now 2.5 minutes away, with the 40 OneWeb satellites, another launch from California on tap now for tomorrow night. It was scheduled for tonight, now been delayed to tomorrow night. The Dragon spacecraft coming back from the International Space Station with hardware and experiments. And later this week, a Falcon Heavy launch is on tap from Kennedy Space Center. 2 minutes away from tonight's mission now. At this point in the countdown, SpaceX should be securing and ending the load of liquid oxygen on the Falcon 9 rocket.
Stage 2 LOX load complete.
Yes, launch closeouts.
Coming up on T-minus 60 seconds, that's when the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take control of the countdown. And T-minus 60 seconds and counting, less than a minute away from SpaceX's second launch of the year. This mission is set to deploy 40 more internet satellites into orbit for OneWeb.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
SpaceX launch director, go for launch.
T-minus 25 seconds. Minus 15. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine ignition. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, boosting 40 more satellites into orbit for OneWeb's global internet network. Falcon 9 has cleared the launch towers at pad 40. T plus 22 seconds, everything looking good so far. Plus 1 minute. Falcon 9 now supersonic. Falcon 9 is now past Max-Q, the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. Everything looking good as the flight approaches the T plus 90 second mark. The 229-foot tall Falcon 9 being powered by 9 Merlin engines, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust heading offshore to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. 1 minute 50 seconds, about 20 seconds now remaining until the expected time of mainage and cutoff. That'll be followed by stage separation and ignition of the second stage of the Falcon 9 to continue the climb into orbit. The first stage will flip around and reverse course to head back to Cape Canaveral. There's main engine cutoff. Looks like we have stage separation, and we see visual indication of ignition of the second stage and now ignition of the first stage booster for the boost back burn. 3 engines firing on the first stage now. with now the Falcon 9 now out of visual range at Cape Canaveral as the second stage continues into orbit. We're now switching over to SpaceX and their live feed of the Falcon 9 launch, showing an onboard camera view now from the second stage engine as it's glowing red hot, powering into orbit with these 40 OneWeb satellites on board. We also saw confirmation just a moment ago of payload fairing jettison. So the nose cone of the Falcon 9 has been released to fall into the Atlantic Ocean. That'll be recovered by a downrange ship in SpaceX's fleet for refurbishment and reuse. On the left side here is a view from the first stage booster looking down at the Florida coast, the city lights of Florida visible for this middle of the night launch as we approach the midnight hour here in Florida. T+5 minutes. The clock down at the bottom of this SpaceX feed has a little bit of a lag, as you can see. It's about a 15-second delay in this video feed from SpaceX compared to real time. Now about 3 minutes, less than 3 minutes from the landing of the first stage. You can see the lights of Cape Canaveral down below as the Falcon 9 booster is now 100 kilometers, 100,000 meters above the surface. In the next few moments, actually about a minute or so from now, we expect to see the entry burn. That'll be a relight of the 3 Merlin engines on the first stage to slow the rocket down as it heads back deeper into the atmosphere. We're now seeing a view from our camera of the entry burn now underway. That's the first stage booster making its way back to the ground, and the entry burn is now complete. So we saw that in the sky here over Cape Canaveral. And here's the delayed feed from the onboard camera from SpaceX. On the left is the entry burn underway. We already have seen that burn now completed, and now we're seeing it completed in this view from SpaceX. About a minute and 10 seconds until landing of the first stage back at the Cape. Second stage continues into orbit, passing 14,500 kilometers per hour, nearing orbital velocity with stage 2. The first stage now passing under 3,000 kilometers per hour. 7 minutes into the flight, less than a minute remaining until first stage landing. And now we're seeing the first stage booster landing burn underway, single engine firing to slow this rocket down for its return to landing zone 1. That variable thrust engine firing the center engine of the first stage in preparation for landing. It's now gone below the tree line. We're going to switch over to SpaceX, showing the onboard view of the Falcon 9 booster making its way to landing zone 1. Falcon 9 has landed. Booster 1076 has arrived back at landing zone 1, completing its second flight to space. We're standing by for shutdown of the upper stage engine. After it reaches a preliminary orbit in the next few moments, we should see and hear that confirmation of orbit insertion.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And shutdown of the Merlin vacuum engine now confirmed on the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. We also heard the call of nominal orbit insertion. That's the key call that we want to hear from SpaceX to confirm that the rocket has achieved its expected orbit following this orbit insertion burn, the first burn by the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. So the Falcon 9 is now in an elliptical or oval-shaped or elongated orbit around the planet Earth. It'll be coasting now until T plus 55 minutes, about 45 minutes from now, when that engine on the second stage will relight for a brief maneuver lasting just 3 seconds to circularize its orbit. And that will set the stage for the separation of the 40 OneWeb satellites that are on board this mission. This map from SpaceX shows the location of the second stage passing over the Caribbean Sea, heading out over Panama shortly, then out over the far eastern Pacific Ocean, over the western part of South America, over Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and then heading out over the Pacific Ocean again, eventually flying over Antarctica. Then it will make a northbound swing over the Indian Ocean, and that's where the engine will reignite at T plus 55 minutes to set the stage for the separation of the 40 OneWeb internet satellites. With this Falcon 9 rocket now in orbit with 40 OneWeb satellites on board, we'll await the final confirmation of mission success. That'll come with the second burn of the upper stage engine, as well as the deployment of the 40 OneWeb satellites. That is still the final deployment of the last of the 40 OneWeb satellites is still more than an hour and 15 minutes away. We're going to end our live coverage on this stream right now. But before we sign off, we want to look ahead to upcoming launches. One launch that's not on this list that we thought was going to launch tonight when we made this slide was the Starlink 2-4 mission from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. That mission was supposed to be launching tonight. However, perhaps not surprisingly, the weather out in California did not allow that launch to go ahead. So SpaceX has delayed the Starlink 2-4 mission on a Falcon 9 rocket from tonight and now until tomorrow night at 8:02 p.m. Pacific or 11:02 p.m. Eastern time. So that launch is not on this list, but it is set for January 10th. That is tomorrow night from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. The other launches we're looking ahead at include the long-delayed launch of ABL Space Systems RS-1 launch vehicle. This is one of the new commercial, privately developed small satellite launchers. That first orbital test flight for ABL Space Systems with their small sat launcher is set to fly tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Time or 2200 UTC from the Pacific Spaceport Complex up at Kodiak Island, Alaska. That mission will be targeting a high inclination orbit as a test flight for ABL Space Systems RS-1 rocket. That launch has been delayed now several weeks due to weather and technical issues. And a launch attempt, in fact, earlier today was scrubbed due to high winds. Later in the week, SpaceX's fifth Falcon Heavy rocket is set to lift off from Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. The Falcon 9 rocket is currently out at Pad 39A, horizontal. It'll be lifted vertical later tonight, overnight, we think, for a planned engine test firing or static fire test as early as Tuesday. That test firing is set to ignite the 27 Merlin engines on the Falcon Heavy rocket. And then once that test firing is complete, the Falcon 9 will be returned to the hangar at Pad 39A for integration with its U.S. Space Force payloads. There are two primary spacecraft on this mission. One is a military communications satellite. The other is a testbed satellite that hosts a number of prototypes and experiments heading up to geosynchronous orbit. That launch is currently targeted for no earlier than Friday, January the 13th. However, we understand that the timeline is tight for meeting that current target launch date. The launch has already been delayed from the 12th as preparations have run a bit behind schedule for this mission, which is named USSF 67 for the U.S. Space Force. Next week, SpaceX will be back in action at Pad 40 with another Falcon 9 rocket set to lift off at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, 1200 UTC on January the 18th with the GPS navigation satellite for the U.S. Space Force. That liftoff is set from Pad 40, where we saw tonight's mission depart from 20 minutes ago. And then later in the month, in addition to other SpaceX launches, Japan is scheduled to launch an H-2A rocket from the Tanegashima Space Center with a Japanese intelligence gathering radar satellite. This is a radar spy satellite. They'll be launched on an H-2A rocket from the Tanegashima Space Center on January the 24th U.S. time, January the 25th in Japan. So these are some of the launches we're looking at in the next few weeks. Aside from this, we expect a few more SpaceX launches later this month that aren't listed on this, but we don't have confirmed dates for those yet, so they're not on this list. We hope to confirm those dates in the coming days.
Acquisition of signal, point to readiness. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0. 3, 2, 1, 0.
We're now going to take a brief pause in our coverage. We're going to end this live stream that's been dedicated to this OneWeb launch by SpaceX. However, we're going to redirect you in the chat to our 24/7 live Launchpad channel, our Launchpad stream here on our Spaceflight Now channel. And we'll have continuing coverage of the remainder of this mission on that channel, as well as on our social media feeds and on spaceflightnow.com. As I mentioned, still more than 30 minutes to go in this coast before the restart of the upper stage engine. And then there's a long 30-plus minute deployment sequence for the 40 OneWeb satellites. And the last of those satellites will not be released from the Falcon 9 rocket until an hour and 35 minutes into the flight. That's still an hour and 12 minutes or so from now. So we're going to end this live stream. Thanks for joining us. If you're interested in following the rest of the mission, please hop over to our Launchpad stream here on our YouTube channel. We'll be there with the remainder of the mission.